The spring morning air carried the scent of rain and new grass across the auction yard, but Martha Whitney couldn't appreciate such mercies. She stood with her hands bound behind her back, the rough hemp rope chafing against skin already raw from sleepless nights and fearful days. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, hawking her labor like she was nothing more than livestock. Next we have Martha Whitney, aged 26, skilled in domestic work, cooking, and teaching. Debt of $47 to be worked off at fair wages. The man's tobacco-stained teeth showed in what might have been a smile. Bidding starts at $1. Martha kept her eyes fixed on the weathered planks beneath her feet, counting the knots in the wood to keep from looking at the faces of the men who studied her like they might examine a horse or a plow. She'd heard whispers about where women in her position ended up, saloons, brothels, or worse. The man who'd held her father's note had made his intentions clear enough when he'd suggested alternative arrangements for settling the debt. $5, called a voice from the back. $7, countered another, and Martha's stomach twisted tighter. She thought of her father, dead these 3 weeks from the fever, and the small farm that had been everything to them both. The banknote had come due the day after they'd buried him, and with no money to pay, she'd found herself here in Sweetwater's auction yard, her freedom sold to the highest bidder. $10. This voice was different, deeper, quieter, but it carried across the yard with an authority that made others step aside. Martha risked a glance upward and saw a tall man pushing through the crowd. He wore a simple brown coat and black hat, his face weathered by sun and wind, with gray threading through dark hair at his temples. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at her like merchandise. His brown eyes held something that might have been kindness, or perhaps pity. $15, called the first bidder, a thin man with pale eyes who made Martha's skin crawl. $20, the tall stranger replied without hesitation. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. Any other bids? Going once at $20. The pale-eyed man scowled but shook his head. $20 was more than most had to spare for a debt servant. Sold to Benjamin Hayes for $20. The crowd began to disperse, some muttering about the high price, others moving toward the next lot of goods. Benjamin Hayes approached the platform where Martha stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the open sky, and the careful way he carried himself that suggested old injuries. "Miss Whitney," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Ben Hayes. I run a ranch about 10 miles north of here." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "Your debt agreement. $20 to be worked off at $2 a month, room and board provided. Does that seem fair to you?" Martha blinked in surprise. Most debt holders paid as little as 50 cents a month, stretching the servitude as long as possible. That's generous, Mr. Hayes." "It's fair," he corrected quietly. He gestured to the clerk to untie her hands. A person ought to know when their obligations fulfilled. As the ropes fell away, Martha rubbed her sore wrists, hardly daring to believe this stroke of fortune. "What kind of work will I be doing?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending, general household tasks." His voice was matter-of-fact. "I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, but she's getting on in years and could use help. You mentioned teaching. There are some children in the area who could benefit from proper schooling." The clerk handed over the debt papers, and Ben Hayes folded them carefully into his coat pocket. "We'll head out when you're ready. My wagon's across the street." Martha gathered her few possessions, a worn carpet-bag that held everything she owned in the world, and followed him through the dusty streets of Sweetwater. The wagon was sturdy but well used, pulled by 2 patient-looking horses that nickered softly at their approach. "Can you handle a team?" Ben asked as he loaded her bag into the wagon bed. "Yes, sir. My father taught me." "Good. It's useful skill out here." He helped her onto the bench seat, his touch brief and respectful. "We'll stop at Man's store for supplies, then head home. Man's general store buzzed with the post-auction activity. Ben moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, selecting flour, salt, coffee, and other necessities. When Martha hesitated over a small mirror, he noticed her looking. "Need anything particular?" he asked. "No, sir. I was just—" She flushed, embarrassed by her vanity. She hadn't seen her reflection clearly in weeks and wondered how wild she must look. Without comment, he picked up the mirror and added it to their purchases. "Every person deserves to see themselves proper," he said simply. The ride north from Sweetwater took them through rolling country where spring grass was just beginning to show green against the brown winter stubble. Ben pointed out landmarks, Willow Creek, where they'd crossed on a sturdy wooden bridge, the red rocks that marked the boundary of his land, the distant mountains still capped with snow. "Been ranching here long?" Martha asked, trying to make conversation. 8 years come fall. Bought the place from a man heading to California. Ben's hands were steady on the reins, his voice even. Built it up from not much to something decent. "You work it alone?" "I've got help. Tom Brennan lives in the bunkhouse year-round, and I hire extra hands for roundup and branding." He glanced at her sideways. "Mrs. Chen keeps the house running. She's Chinese, come over with the railroad workers. Her husband died in a cave-in, and she needed work." The way he said it told Martha something about the kind of man Benjamin Hayes was, the sort who gave work to a foreign widow when others might have turned her away. The ranch buildings came into view as they crested a low hill. The house was larger than Martha had expected, built of stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A barn, corrals, and several outbuildings spoke of prosperity earned through hard work. Chickens pecked in a fenced yard, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. "It's beautiful," Martha said, and meant it. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, the sight of this well-tended place filled her with something that might have been hope. A small, neat woman emerged from the house as they pulled up. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dark eyes took in Martha with shrewd assessment. "Mrs. Chen," Ben said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Martha Whitney. She'll be helping you with the house and teaching the local children." Mrs. Chen bowed slightly. "Welcome, Miss Whitney. You look tired. Come, we get you settled." The interior of the house was clean and comfortable, with solid furniture and cheerful curtains at the windows. Mrs. Chen led Martha up a narrow staircase to a small but pleasant room under the eaves. A bed with a thick quilt, a washstand, and a wooden chair comprised the furnishings, but after sleeping in barns and back rooms for the past weeks, it seemed like luxury. "You rest now," Mrs. Chen said, setting Martha's bag on the chair. "Supper at 6. Mr. Ben, he likes to eat on time." Alone for the first time in what felt like forever, Martha sank onto the bed and let herself absorb the reality of her situation. She was safe, at least for now. The room was clean and warm, and Benjamin Hayes seemed like a decent man. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was so much better than what she'd feared. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Whitney?" Ben's voice came through the door. "When you're ready, I'll show you around the place. Help you get your bearings." Martha splashed water on her face from the basin, smoothed her hair as best she could, and opened the door. Ben stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking oddly formal. "Better?" he asked, noticing her tidied appearance. "Yes, thank you." She followed him downstairs and out onto the porch. "Mr. Hayes, I want you to know how grateful I am. What you did today." "What I did today was hire help I needed," he interrupted gently. "No more than that." But Martha could see the kindness in his eyes, even if he wouldn't acknowledge it. She followed him around the ranch as he showed her the layout, the kitchen garden where vegetables would be planted, the chicken coop that was her responsibility to tend, the root cellar where supplies were stored through the winter months. "Mrs. Chen will show you the routine," he explained as they walked. Breakfast before dawn, dinner at noon, supper at 6. Washing on Mondays, baking on Tuesdays. You'll find she runs a tight household, but she's fair. They paused by the corral where several horses stood watching their approach. A bay mare stretched her neck toward Martha, who reached out carefully to stroke the soft nose. "That's Rosie," Ben said. "She's gentle, good for riding if you're comfortable with horses." "I love horses," Martha admitted. "My father and I only had one old mare, but she was my dearest friend." Something in Ben's expression softened. "Then you and Rosie will get along fine." As they completed the circuit back to the house, Martha found herself thinking this might work out well. The debt would be paid in less than a year. Ben Hayes seemed honorable, and Mrs. Chen appeared kind despite her stern exterior. Perhaps her father's death and the loss of their farm didn't have to mean the end of everything good in her life. Supper that first night was a quiet affair. Mrs. Chen had prepared beef stew and fresh bread, and Martha complimented the cooking genuinely. Ben spoke little, asking only if she had everything she needed and whether the room was comfortable. After the meal, he excused himself to check on the stock, leaving Martha to help Mrs. Chen clear the dishes. "Mr. Ben is good man," Mrs. Chen said quietly as they worked. "Lost his wife 3 years ago to the typhoid. Baby too. Very sad." She glanced at Martha meaningfully. "He work very hard, keep busy. Sometimes I think he forget how to smile." The information explained the sadness Martha had glimpsed in Ben's eyes, the careful distance he maintained. She understood grief. It had been her companion these past weeks, and she recognized its shape in others. "The children I'm to teach?" Martha asked, changing the subject. "How many are there?" 6, maybe 7. Jennings' family has 3. Miller family has 2. Others come when they can spare them from work. Mrs. Chen dried a plate with brisk efficiency. "No proper school here. Some parents try to teach letters, but most can't read themselves." The prospect of teaching again lifted Martha's spirits. She'd helped her father instruct the local children back home, and she missed the satisfaction of watching young minds grasp new concepts. That night, Martha lay in her narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, the hoot of an owl, wind through the eaves. For the first time in weeks, she felt something approaching peace. Tomorrow would bring work, and work would bring purpose. Eventually, if she proved herself useful, perhaps Benjamin Hayes would offer her permanent employment once her debt was satisfied. The days that followed established a routine that Martha found comforting. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast, spent the morning cleaning and mending, and devoted afternoons to organizing lessons for the local children. Ben had cleared out a small room on the ground floor for her use as a schoolroom, and parents began bringing their children for instruction 3 times a week. "You're a natural teacher," Tom Brennan observed one afternoon as he watched Martha working with 7-year-old Sally Jennings on her letters. Tom was a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked for Ben since the ranch's early days. "Got the patience for it." Martha smiled, steadying Sally's hand as she formed the letter M. "My father always said teaching was just helping people find what they already knew." "Wise man, your father." "He was." The familiar ache of loss tightened Martha's chest, but it was gentler now, softened by the passage of time and the comfort of useful work. Ben appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Sorry to interrupt. Tom, we need to check the north pasture fence before evening." "Yes, sir." Tom touched his hat brim to Martha. "Miss Martha, always a pleasure." As Tom headed out, Ben lingered a moment. "How are the lessons going?" "Very well. The children are eager to learn." Martha helped Sally pack her slate and primers. "I was thinking we might organize a spelling bee once they've progressed further. Give them something to work toward." "Good idea." Ben's approval warmed Martha more than it should have. Mrs. Chen mentioned you've been helping her preserve vegetables for winter storage too. She's teaching me techniques I didn't know. My father and I never had much of a garden. Ben nodded, then seemed to hesitate before speaking again. Martha, I want you to know you're settling in well here. The work you're doing, it's appreciated. The use of her first name sent a small flutter through Martha's chest. Over the past weeks, their interaction had remained formally polite, but occasionally she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Thank you, Ben. She used his given name deliberately, testing the boundaries. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or pleasure at hearing his name spoken in her voice. But the moment passed quickly, and he was turning away. I should join Tom. We'll be back for supper. Martha watched him go, noting the easy way he moved despite the slight favor he gave his left leg, an old injury, perhaps from his younger days. She was learning to read the small details that revealed Ben Hayes beneath the careful reserve he maintained. Spring progressed into early summer, and with it came longer days and harder work. Martha threw herself into her tasks with determination, rising earlier to help with the expanded garden, staying up later to mend clothes and prepare lessons. Mrs. Chen seemed pleased with her diligence, and even praised her bread-making, which was no small accomplishment given the older woman's exacting standards. One evening in late May, as Martha sat on the porch mending Ben's work shirt by lamplight, she heard the sound of a harmonica drifting from the barn. The melody was plaintive and sweet, speaking of loneliness and long nights under open skies. Without thinking, she found herself humming along, adding her voice to the solitary tune. The music stopped abruptly, and she looked up to see Ben standing in the barn doorway, harmonica still in his hand. Even in the dim light, she could see his surprise. "I'm sorry," Martha said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude. It's just, the song was so beautiful." Ben walked slowly toward the porch, still holding the harmonica. "My wife used to sing along," he said quietly. "I haven't played much since." "She had a lovely voice, I imagine." "She did." Ben settled into the chair beside Martha's, the harmonica resting loosely in his hands. Anna could sing anything, hymns, ballads, little songs she made up while she worked. House was always full of music when she was alive. It was the most personal thing he'd shared since Martha's arrival, and she sensed the trust it represented. "Would you play again? If it doesn't pain you too much." Ben looked at her for a long moment, then raised the harmonica to his lips. This time the melody was lighter, more hopeful, and Martha hummed along softly, her voice weaving around the notes like thread through fabric. When the song ended, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. "You have a gift for harmony," Ben said finally. "My mother sang in the church choir. I learned by listening." Martha folded the mended shirt carefully. "Music makes work lighter, don't you think? Makes the hard times easier to bear." "Yes," Ben agreed. "I'd forgotten that." A week later, official-looking men arrived at the ranch. Martha was hanging laundry when she saw the dust cloud approaching, and something in the purposeful way the riders moved made her stomach tighten with apprehension. She called to Mrs. Chen, who emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron. "What they want?" Mrs. Chen asked, squinting at the approaching party. "I don't know, but I don't like the look of them." Ben appeared from the barn, Tom beside him, both men's hands resting casually near their weapons. The riders pulled up in the yard, their leader dismounting with the arrogance of a man accustomed to deference. "Benjamin Hayes?" The man consulted an official-looking document. "I'm Clayton Ward, Territorial Revenue Collector. We've had reports of irregularities in your property assessment." Ben's expression remained neutral, but Martha caught the slight tensing of his shoulders. "What kind of irregularities?" "Underreporting of improvements, livestock counts that don't match territorial records, possible tax evasion." Ward's pale eyes swept over the ranch buildings with calculating interest. "We'll need to conduct a thorough assessment." "I've paid my taxes in full every year," Ben replied evenly. "Got the receipts to prove it." "We'll be the judge of that." Ward gestured to his men, who began dismounting. "This inspection will take several days. We'll need accommodations and meals while we work." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. There was something predatory in Ward's manner, something that reminded her uncomfortably of the pale-eyed man who'd bid on her at the auction. She caught Ben's eye and saw her own suspicion reflected there. "You're welcome to examine the records," Ben said carefully. "But I'll need to see your official authorization." Ward produced papers with an flourish. "All proper and legal. Now, about those accommodations." "The bunkhouse has extra beds," Tom offered reluctantly. "Not suitable for territorial officials," Ward replied smoothly. "We'll require rooms in the main house." Ben's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The main house is private property. Under territorial law, we're entitled to appropriate accommodations during official business." Ward's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you understand the importance of cooperation with territorial authorities." Martha watched this exchange with growing alarm. Something was very wrong here, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. The papers looked official enough, but Ward's manner spoke of corruption and hidden agendas. She thought of her father's warnings about men who used the law for their own purposes, twisting justice to serve greed. As the men settled in for what promised to be an uncomfortable few days, Martha found herself watching Ward and his associates with careful attention. They asked too many questions about the ranch's profitability, showed too much interest in the property boundaries, and made too many comments about the quality of the buildings and improvements. That evening, as she served supper to the unwelcome guests, Martha overheard fragments of their conversation that made her blood run cold. Prime railroad land. Tax seizure is perfectly legal if we document enough violations. Hayes won't be able to fight it, not with his background. She managed to maintain her composure through the meal, but as soon as the dishes were cleared, she sought out Ben. She found him in the barn, checking on a mare who was due to foal soon. "Ben," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I need to tell you something about those men." He looked up from examining the mare, his expression alert. "What is it?" Martha repeated what she'd heard, watching his face grow grim as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hand automatically stroking the mare's neck. "I was afraid of something like this," he said finally. "There's been talk in town about railroad speculation, men buying up land through questionable means. What can we do?" "Fight it if it comes to that. But they'll have the law on their side, or at least the appearance of it." Ben's voice was heavy with frustration. A man can work his whole life to build something, only to have it stolen by men in suits with official papers. Martha felt a surge of anger on his behalf. This ranch represented everything good about frontier life: honest work, careful stewardship, a home built through dedication and sacrifice. The thought of men like Ward destroying it for profit made her furious. "There has to be something," she insisted. "Some way to expose what they're really doing." Ben looked at her with surprise, perhaps at the intensity in her voice. "Why does it matter to you? You'll be moving on once your debt's paid." The question caught Martha off guard, forcing her to examine feelings she'd been trying to ignore. Why did it matter so much? Because this place had become home in a way she'd never expected? Because she'd grown to care for the quiet, honorable man who'd saved her from a terrible fate? Because the thought of leaving here in a few months filled her with unexpected sorrow? "Because it's wrong," she said finally. "Because you're a good man who deserves better. Because—" She stopped, unable to voice the deeper truth. Ben stepped closer, his eyes searching her face in the dim barn light. "Because what, Martha?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both step apart. Tom appeared in the barn doorway, his expression troubled. "Ben, you need to know, those men have been asking questions about Martha. Want to know her background, how she came to be here." Tom's weathered face was grim. "Don't like the feel of it." Martha's heart sank as she realized the implications. Her status as a debt servant made her vulnerable, gave men like Ward potential leverage against Ben. She'd hoped her past could remain private, but it seemed even that small mercy was to be denied. "They can't touch her," Ben said firmly. "Her debt contract is legal and binding." "Maybe," Tom said. "But men like that, they find ways around the law when it suits them." As Martha lay awake that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of strangers in the house, she found herself praying for the first time since her father's death. She prayed for wisdom, for protection, for some way to preserve the fragile peace she'd found here. And beneath those prayers was a deeper plea, that she might find the courage to fight for what had come to matter more than her own safety. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain or worse. Martha pulled her quilt closer and tried to find sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and harder choices. The peaceful days of spring were ending, and summer would test them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But in the darkness, she clung to one certainty. Whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. Ben Hayes had saved her once already, and if God was willing, perhaps together they could save each other from the troubles brewing like thunder in the distance. The storm broke 3 days later, bringing with it the kind of rain that transformed dry creek beds into rushing torrents and turned dusty roads into impassable mud. Martha stood at the kitchen window watching sheets of water cascade from the eaves, grateful for the barrier the weather provided between the ranch and any unwelcome visitors from town. Clayton Ward and his men had departed the previous morning, their so-called assessment complete, leaving behind an atmosphere of barely contained tension. They'd found numerous violations, livestock counts that didn't match their records, improvements they claimed hadn't been properly reported, water rights they questioned despite Ben's clear documentation. The final tally, according to Ward's calculations, showed back taxes and penalties totaling nearly $300. "Might as well ask for the moon," Tom had muttered after the men rode away. Ben had said nothing, but Martha had seen the set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he read through Ward's official notice. $300 was more than most ranchers saw in cash money over 2 years. It was, as Ward undoubtedly knew, an impossible sum. Now, with the rain drumming on the roof and the house warm from Mrs. Chen's cooking, Martha tried to push aside her worries and focus on the task at hand. She was teaching young Billy Jennings his arithmetic while his sisters worked on their reading primers, their parents having delivered them before the storm hit in earnest. If a farmer has 24 chickens and sells 1/3 of them at market, how many chickens does he have left? Martha asked, watching Billy work through the problem on his slate. 16, Billy answered after careful calculation. Very good. Now, if those chickens each lay 5 eggs a week, how many eggs would he collect? Billy's face scrunched in concentration. At 9 years old, he was quick with numbers but struggled when problems required multiple steps. Martha had learned to be patient, breaking complex ideas into manageable pieces. 80 eggs, he said finally, his face brightening with pride. Excellent work. Martha marked his progress in her lesson book, noting areas where he needed additional practice. The children's education had become increasingly important to her over the summer months, a tangible way to contribute something lasting to the community. Ben appeared in the doorway, water dripping from his hat and coat. Storm's getting worse. Billy, I think you and your sisters had better stay until it passes. Martha looked up from her teaching, immediately concerned. Is it safe for them to travel? Not in this weather. Creek's already running high, and it'll only get worse. Ben hung his wet things on pegs by the door. I'll ride over to the Jennings place when the rain lets up. Let them know the children are safe." "They can sleep in my room," Martha offered. "I'll make pallets on the floor." "Mrs. Chen's already preparing extra beds in the spare room," Ben said. "The children will be comfortable." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Chen appeared with steaming mugs of milk sweetened with honey. "Children need warm food on cold day," she announced, distributing the treats. "Martha, you help me prepare extra supper. Mr. Ben gets soaked to skin-checking stock." The domesticity of the scene struck Martha with unexpected poignancy. This was what a real family felt like. Children safe inside while storms raged outside, adults working together to provide comfort and security. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this was her permanent life, that these weren't temporary arrangements born of debt and circumstance. "I'll change into dry clothes and check the animals one more time," Ben said, but his eyes lingered on Martha as she helped the children settle with their milk. Something in his expression made her pulse quicken, a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. That evening, with the children fed and settled in their makeshift bedroom, the adults gathered around the kitchen table. The rain continued its steady drumming, and occasional lightning illuminated the windows with brief, stark brightness. Mrs. Chen had retired early, leaving Martha and Ben alone with their coffee and the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over the months. "I've been thinking about Ward's assessment," Martha said finally, breaking the silence that stretched between them. Ben looked up from his cup, his brown eyes serious. "And?" The whole thing felt rehearsed, like he knew exactly what violations he was going to find before he arrived. Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping. "What if we could prove the assessment was fraudulent?" "How would we do that?" "The territorial records he claimed to be using, someone in the territorial office would have copies. If we could examine them, compare them to what Ward presented." Martha's mind raced through possibilities. There might be discrepancies, evidence that he falsified his findings. Ben was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. That would mean a trip to the territorial capital. 2 days' ride each way, minimum. "I could go," Martha said impulsively. "I know how to research records, and Ward wouldn't expect a woman to challenge his work." "Absolutely not." Ben's response was immediate and firm. "It's too dangerous, and besides, you're needed here." The automatic refusal stung more than Martha cared to admit. "Because I'm a debt servant who can't be trusted with important business?" Ben's eyes widened with surprise. "Because I won't risk your safety chasing after evidence that might not exist." "But you'd risk your own safety?" "That's different." "How is it different?" Martha stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked the glass. "Because I'm a woman? Because you think I'm not capable of handling difficult situations?" "Because you matter to me." The words hung in the air between them, charged with emotion neither had been willing to acknowledge. Martha turned slowly to face Ben, who had risen from his chair, his face a mixture of surprise and something deeper. "Martha, He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "I didn't mean to say that." "Did you mean it?" Ben's struggle was visible in his expression, the careful walls he'd built around his heart warring with feelings he'd tried to suppress. "I can't afford to mean it." "Why not?" "Because you'll be leaving when your debt is paid. Because I have nothing to offer except a ranch that might be seized for back taxes. Because I'm not a man who gets second chances at happiness." Martha crossed the room to stand in front of him, close enough to see the pain in his eyes, the careful loneliness he'd carried for so long. "What if I don't want to leave? What if I want to stay and fight for this place, for what we could build together?" Ben's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Don't say things you don't mean, Martha. Don't offer hope I can't afford to accept. I mean every word." She covered his hands with her own. "I know what it's like to lose everything, Ben. I also know what it's like to find something worth fighting for." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd convinced himself he'd never feel such emotions again. Martha kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring months of suppressed feelings into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling with the force of acknowledged desire. "This changes everything," Ben whispered against her forehead. "It changes nothing," Martha replied firmly. "We were already fighting for this place, for each other. Now we're just admitting it." Thunder crashed overhead, and in its wake they heard a different sound, horses splashing through the mud outside. Ben immediately stepped away from Martha, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Stay inside," he ordered quietly, moving toward the window. Martha ignored the instruction, positioning herself where she could see the yard. Through the rain, she made out 3 riders approaching the house, their faces obscured by hat brims and rain slickers. One dismounted and splashed toward the porch. "Hayes!" The voice carried over the storm. "Open up. Official business." Ben cursed under his breath. "Ward! What the hell does he want now?" The pounding on the door was aggressive, impatient. Ben opened it to find Ward standing on the porch, water streaming from his coat, his pale eyes bright with malicious satisfaction. "Mr. Hayes, sorry to disturb you so late, but new information has come to light regarding your tax situation." "It's past 9 o'clock in a thunderstorm," Ben replied evenly. "Whatever business you have can wait until morning." "I'm afraid it can't." Ward pushed past Ben into the kitchen, his 2 associates following. "We've received reports of additional violations, harboring a debt servant without proper documentation, operating a school without territorial licensing, possible irregularities in your livestock purchases." Martha felt ice form in her stomach. Someone had been watching them, reporting on their daily activities. The thought of being observed, judged, catalogued like evidence in a criminal case made her skin crawl. "My documentation is in order," Ben said carefully. "Miss Whitney's debt contract is properly filed, and the children's education is informal, requiring no license." "Perhaps. But given the seriousness of the accumulated violations, I'm authorized to place the property under territorial protection pending final assessment." Ward produced an official-looking document. "This authorizes us to take possession of the ranch effective immediately." The words hit Martha like physical blows. This was it, the moment she dreaded since Ward's first visit. They were stealing Ben's ranch using the law as their weapon, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to stop it. "You can't just seize a man's property," Ben protested, but Martha could hear the defeat creeping into his voice. "I can and I am." Ward gestured to his men. "Johnson, Miller, secure the premises. Mr. Hayes, you and your household have until tomorrow evening to remove your personal effects." "The children," Martha said suddenly, stepping forward. "There are children sleeping upstairs. You can't turn them out in this storm." Ward's gaze settled on her with predatory interest. "Ah, Miss Whitney. Or should I say Mrs. Hayes? We've heard rumors about irregular relationships under this roof." "What are you implying?" Ben's voice carried a warning that made Ward's associates shift nervously. "I'm stating that if there have been improper relations between an employer and his debt servant, that constitutes a violation of territorial moral statutes. The penalties could be quite severe." Martha felt the trap closing around them. Ward had come prepared for any contingency, any argument they might raise. The law, twisted and corrupted, was his weapon of choice. "There have been no improper relations," she said clearly. "My conduct has been above reproach." "Has it?" "Living unmarried under the same roof, unchaperoned for months." Ward smiled coldly. "The territorial court takes a dim view of such arrangements." Ben stepped protectively in front of Martha. "Whatever accusations you're making, direct them at me. Miss Whitney has done nothing wrong." Noble sentiment, but legally irrelevant. Unless, of course, there was some formal arrangement that legitimized the relationship. Ward let the implication hang in the air. Martha understood immediately what he was suggesting. Marriage would change the legal dynamic, would eliminate the charge of improper relations. But it would also bind her permanently to Ben's fate, whatever that might be. "We could be married tonight," she said quietly. "Tom Brennan is ordained, authorized to perform ceremonies." Ben turned to stare at her, shock plain on his face. "Martha, you don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly." She met his gaze steadily. "The question is whether you're willing to accept my proposal." Ward's expression darkened. He'd clearly expected them to crumble under pressure, not find a legal solution to his accusations. "A marriage of convenience won't solve your tax problems, Hayes." "But it will solve the moral violation you're trying to manufacture," Martha replied coolly. "Unless you're admitting that charge was fabricated?" For a moment, Ward's mask slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Then he regained his composure, shrugging with apparent indifference. "Marry if you wish. It won't save this property." He gestured to his men. "Secure the outbuildings. We'll complete the seizure tomorrow." After Ward and his men departed to shelter in the barn, Ben and Martha stood in the suddenly quiet kitchen, the magnitude of what had just happened settling between them. "You don't have to do this," Ben said quietly. "Marriage to save my reputation won't help if I lose everything anyway." "I'm not marrying you to save your reputation," Martha replied. "I'm marrying you because I love you, and because we're stronger together than apart." Ben's eyes searched her face as if looking for doubt or deception. "Martha, if we do this, there's no taking it back. If we lose the ranch, you'll be tied to a man with nothing to offer. Then we won't lose the ranch." Martha took his hands in hers. "We'll find a way to fight this, to expose Ward's corruption. But we'll do it as husband and wife." Ben was quiet for a long moment, then he squeezed her hands gently. "Tom's probably wondering what all the commotion was about. Should I ask him to fetch his Bible?" Martha's answer was to stand on her toes and kiss him, soft and sure and full of promise. When they broke apart, Ben rested his forehead against hers. "Are you certain about this?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The ceremony, such as it was, took place in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen and the children as witnesses. Tom Brennan, roused from his bunk and hastily dressed, performed the brief service with solemn dignity despite the unusual circumstances. Martha wore her best dress, hastily pressed, while Ben had managed to find a clean shirt and jacket. "Do you, Benjamin Hayes, take Martha Whitney to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "Do you, Martha Whitney, take Benjamin Hayes to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife. Ben, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promises they would have time to explore once the immediate crisis passed. When they separated, Martha saw tears in Ben's eyes. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "Never," she whispered back. Mrs. Chen produced a bottle of wine she'd been saving for special occasions, and they shared a toast with the children, giggling at the adult proceedings they didn't quite understand. Despite the circumstances that had precipitated the ceremony, Martha found herself genuinely happy. She was Mrs. Benjamin Hayes now, bound to the man she'd come to love, committed to fighting for their shared future. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Martha woke in Ben's arms for the first time as his wife, savoring the simple pleasure of legitimate intimacy. Their wedding night had been tender and sweet, a gentle claiming that spoke of deep emotion rather than mere passion. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," Ben murmured against her hair. "Good morning, husband." Martha settled more comfortably against his chest. "Ready to face whatever Ward has planned?" "With you beside me? I'm ready for anything." Their moment of peace was interrupted by urgent knocking on the bedroom door. "Ben." "Martha." Tom's voice carried alarm. "You need to come quick." They dressed hurriedly and rushed outside to find Tom standing in the yard with several of their neighbors, the Jennings family, the Millers, and others Martha recognized from church services. All looked angry and determined. "What's happening?" Ben asked. "Word spread about what Ward tried to pull," Jim Jennings explained. "Nobody's buying his assessment story. We've all paid our taxes proper, and we all know you have too." "More than that," added Sarah Miller. "My cousin works in the territorial office. She says there's no record of any special assessment authorized for this area." Martha felt hope bloom in her chest. Ward was operating without proper authority? "Looks that way. Which means his seizure order is worthless." Jim spat into the dust. "Question is, what do we do about it?" "We ride to town," Ben said decisively. "Present the evidence to Sheriff Mann. Demand Ward's arrest for fraud." "Already thought of that," Tom said grimly. "Mann's been bought off. Word is he's leaving town this morning with a pocket full of Ward's money." The hope in Martha's chest withered. If the local law enforcement was corrupted, they had few options for legal recourse. "Then we handle it ourselves," declared Frank Miller, his weathered hand resting on his gun butt. "No." Ben's voice was firm. "We do this legal, or we don't do it at all. There has to be another way." Martha's mind raced through possibilities. They needed proof of Ward's corruption, evidence that would stand up to territorial scrutiny. They needed to expose not just his fraudulent assessment, but the entire scheme he represented. "The territorial capital," she said suddenly. "We need to get word to the territorial governor, present our evidence directly." "That's a 3-day ride," Jim pointed out. "Ward could have the property sold to his railroad friends by then." "Not if we delay him," Martha said, an idea forming. "What if Ward couldn't complete his seizure because the property was contested? What if we filed a formal appeal?" "With what court?" Ben asked. "The territorial court in Phoenix. I could ride there, file the necessary papers, request an emergency stay of seizure pending investigation." "Martha, no. It's too dangerous. It's our only legal option." Martha turned to address the gathered neighbors. "How many of you would be willing to sign affidavits testifying to Ward's irregular conduct? Sworn statements about his threats, his lack of proper authority?" Hands went up around the group. These were honest people who'd worked hard for what they had, and they recognized the threat Ward represented to their entire community. "I'll go with Martha," Sarah Miller volunteered. "Two women traveling together draw less attention than a man riding alone." "And I'll organize the others to keep Ward occupied here," Tom suggested. "Slow him down with legal challenges, paperwork delays, anything to buy time." Ben looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people who'd come together to fight a common threat. Martha could see him weighing options, calculating risks. "If we do this," he said finally, "we do it right. Proper legal documents, sworn affidavits, everything above board. We prove we're better than men like Ward." "Then we'd better get started," Martha said. "Every hour we delay gives Ward more time to solidify his position." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Martha packed light for the journey while Sarah Miller gathered supplies and prepared her own horse. The men worked together to prepare legal documents and affidavits, using Martha's knowledge of legal language to ensure everything was properly worded. Mrs. Chen took Martha aside as she prepared to leave, pressing a small cloth bundle into her hands. "Medicines," the older woman explained. "For journey sickness, for injuries. You come back safe, you hear? Mr. Ben need you now." "I'll come back," Martha promised. "This is my home now. These are my people." Ben walked with her to where the horses waited, his face grave with worry. "I hate letting you go," he said quietly. "If something happens to you—" "Nothing will happen. I'll be careful, and I'll be back in 5 days with the papers we need to stop Ward." Martha stood on her toes to kiss him. "Keep our home safe until I return." "Always," Ben promised, his arms tightening around her. As Martha and Sarah Miller rode away from the ranch, Martha looked back once to see Ben standing with their neighbors, united in common cause. For the first time since Ward's arrival, she felt genuine hope. They were fighting back, using the law as it was meant to be used, seeking justice rather than yielding to corruption. The road to Phoenix stretched ahead, dusty and uncertain. But Martha faced it without fear, knowing that behind her stood a community worth fighting for, and ahead lay the chance to preserve the life she'd found in the arms of the man she loved. They would win this battle, she told herself firmly. They had to. Too much depended on it, their home, their future, the very principle that honest work and honest living meant something in this hard land. Clayton Ward might have the appearance of law on his side, but they had something stronger, the truth and the determination to see it served. The territorial capital of Phoenix sprawled under the desert sun like a collection of adobe blocks scattered by a giant's hand. Martha and Sarah Miller rode into town on their second day of travel, dust-covered and weary but determined. The courthouse stood at the center of the settlement, its bell tower marking it as the seat of territorial justice. "Never seen so many buildings in one place," Sarah murmured, her eyes wide as they navigated the busy streets. Martha had visited larger cities with her father, but even she felt overwhelmed by the bustling activity. Merchants hawked their wares, territorial officials strode importantly between buildings, and the general chaos of frontier commerce filled the air with noise and dust. They secured their horses at a livery stable and made their way to the courthouse. Inside, the cool adobe walls provided relief from the heat, and Martha approached the clerk's desk with the carefully prepared documents. "I need to file an emergency appeal and request for stay of seizure," she announced, placing the papers before a tired-looking man with ink-stained fingers. The clerk examined the documents with professional skepticism. "This concerns property in Sweetwater County?" "Yes, sir. My husband's ranch is being illegally seized under false tax assessments." "You have supporting evidence?" Martha produced the affidavits from their neighbors, each sworn statement carefully detailing Ward's irregular conduct and lack of proper authorization. The clerk read through them with growing interest. "These are serious allegations," he said finally. "Fraud, corruption of territorial officials, unauthorized seizure of private property." He looked up at Martha with new respect. "You prepared these documents yourself?" "Yes, sir. My father was a judge back in Kansas. He taught me legal procedure. Shows. These are better written than half the papers that cross my desk." The clerk stamped the documents with official seals. "I can file your appeal and request, but getting it before a judge quickly, that's another matter." "How long would it normally take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. The territorial judge is riding circuit, won't be back until next Monday at the earliest. Martha's heart sank. By then, Ward could have completed his fraudulent seizure and disappeared with the proceeds. "Isn't there anything that can be done sooner?" The clerk studied her thoughtfully. "There might be. Judge Harrison is in town temporarily, hearing a land dispute case. He's got authority to issue emergency orders if the situation warrants it." "Could we see him today?" "Not officially. But The clerk glanced around, then leaned closer. Judge Harrison takes his evening meal at the Territorial Hotel. Man likes to discuss legal matters over dinner. If someone were to approach him informally, present a compelling case. Martha understood immediately. What time does he usually dine? 7 o'clock, sharp. Table by the window, always orders the beefsteak. That evening, Martha waited nervously in the hotel dining room, her best dress cleaned and pressed, her documents organized in a leather folder she'd borrowed from Sarah. Judge Harrison proved to be a distinguished man in his 60s, with gray whiskers and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Judge Harrison? Martha approached his table as he finished his meal. I'm Martha Hayes from Sweetwater County. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time regarding a legal matter. The judge gestured to the empty chair across from him. Please sit. What brings you so far from home, Mrs. Hayes? Martha presented her case carefully, laying out the evidence of Ward's corruption and the illegal seizure of her husband's property. Judge Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of territorial law. You say this Clayton Ward claimed to be conducting an official assessment? He asked when she finished. Yes, sir. But according to my neighbor whose cousin works in the territorial office, no such assessment was authorized. Judge Harrison's expression grew stern. That's a serious charge. If proven, it would constitute fraud under territorial statute. He examined the affidavits carefully. These statements from your neighbors are quite damning. They're willing to testify under oath. Yes, sir. Every one of them. And you prepared these documents yourself? My father trained me in legal procedure before his death. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Shows proper understanding of the law. Tell me, Mrs. Hayes, what exactly are you requesting? An emergency stay of seizure pending full investigation and authorization for territorial marshals to investigate Ward's conduct. Bold requests. Do you understand the implications if your allegations prove false? Martha met his gaze steadily. I understand, Your Honor. But I also understand that if good people don't stand up to corruption, it spreads like poison through the whole system. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, then he smiled slightly. Your father trained you well, both in law and in principle. He reached into his coat for paper and pen. I'm issuing a temporary restraining order against any seizure of the Hayes property pending investigation. I'm also ordering Territorial Marshal Williams to travel to Sweetwater County immediately to investigate these allegations. Martha felt tears of relief well in her eyes. Thank you, Your Honor. You don't know what this means to us. I know exactly what it means, Judge Harrison replied gravely. It means the law still means something in this territory, despite the efforts of men like Ward to corrupt it. The ride back to Sweetwater County passed in a blur of urgency and hope. Martha and Sarah pushed their horses hard, stopping only when necessary to rest the animals. Martha carried Judge Harrison's orders in her saddlebags like precious treasure, knowing they represented not just salvation for her and Ben, but vindication of everything her father had believed about justice and the rule of law. They crested the final hill overlooking the Hayes Ranch on a crisp October morning, autumn painting the landscape in shades of gold and rust. What they saw below made Martha's heart leap with joy and pride. The yard was full of wagons and horses, and she could see neighbors working together on various projects around the property. Looks like the whole county turned out, Sarah observed with satisfaction. As they rode into the yard, Martha saw Ben emerge from the barn, his face lighting up when he spotted her. She dismounted and ran to him, not caring who might be watching as he swept her into his arms. "Thank God you're safe," he murmured against her hair. "I've been going half crazy with worry." "I've got the papers," Martha said breathlessly. Judge Harrison issued an emergency stay. Ward can't touch the property until there's a full investigation. Ben's whoop of joy brought people running from all directions. Soon Martha was surrounded by neighbors eager to hear her news, their faces bright with relief and vindication. "Where's Ward now?" Martha asked when the initial celebration died down. "Gone," Tom Brennan reported with satisfaction. "Lit out yesterday when Marshal Williams arrived. Left his men behind to face the music." "Marshal Williams is here?" "In town, taking statements and making arrests," Jim Jennings confirmed. "Turns out Ward's been running this same scheme in 3 other counties. You and Judge Harrison just gave the marshal the evidence he needed to bring down the whole operation." Mrs. Chen appeared at Martha's elbow with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. "You eat now," she commanded. "Too skinny from hard riding. Mr. Ben worry himself sick while you gone." That evening, as the neighbors departed and normal quiet returned to the ranch, Martha and Ben sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The first frost of winter sparkled on the grass, and the air carried the promise of snow in the high country. "No regrets about marrying a debt servant?" Martha asked, settling against Ben's shoulder. "No regrets about marrying the bravest woman in Arizona Territory," Ben replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I do wonder what our children will think when they hear the story of how we met." "Our children." Martha's heart fluttered at the casual reference to their future family. "I'm hoping for at least 3, Ben said solemnly. "Need enough hands to work this place properly." Martha laughed, the sound bright in the gathering dusk. "I love how you think ahead, Benjamin Hayes." "I love how you fight for what matters, Martha Hayes." The winter months that followed proved to be the happiest of Martha's life. With the threat of seizure removed and Ward's corruption exposed, the ranch settled into a peaceful routine. Martha continued teaching the local children, expanding her lessons to include older students who wanted to improve their reading and arithmetic. Ben worked on improvements to the property, building additional corrals and planning for spring planting. Mrs. Chen became not just a housekeeper but a beloved family member, teaching Martha traditional Chinese cooking techniques and sharing stories of her homeland. The older woman's wisdom and gentle humor provided stability as Martha adjusted to her new role as ranch wife and community pillar. In December, Martha realized she was carrying Ben's child. The discovery filled her with joy and wonder, even as morning sickness made her queasy during the early weeks. Ben's delight was infectious, and he began immediately planning additions to the house to accommodate their growing family. "A nursery next to our bedroom," he explained, sketching plans by lamplight. "And we'll need to expand the kitchen if we're having company for christenings and such." "You're assuming a great deal," Martha pointed out, though she couldn't stop smiling at his enthusiasm. "I'm planning for our future," Ben corrected. "Our long, happy future." Christmas brought the whole community together for a celebration at the ranch. Martha organized lessons for the children about the nativity story, while Mrs. Chen and the other women prepared a feast that filled the house with wonderful aromas. Ben and the men shared stories and discussed plans for spring planting and cattle drives. As midnight approached and their guests prepared to return home, Martha felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life she'd found. A year ago, she'd been facing destitution and despair. Now she was surrounded by people who'd become family, married to a man she loved beyond measure, and carrying their child beneath her heart. "Penny for your thoughts," Ben said quietly, joining her by the window where she watched snow begin to fall. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Martha replied. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else, being anyone else." She turned in his arms to face him. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people. I never expected to find it myself." "We found each other," Ben corrected gently. "Everything else just followed." In February, Martha received a letter that brought both joy and sorrow. It was from Judge Harrison, informing her that Clayton Ward had been tried and convicted on multiple counts of fraud and corruption. He'd been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison, and his associates had received similar punishments. The letter also contained news that the territorial government was considering establishing a formal school system, and they wanted Martha to serve as the first certified teacher for the Sweetwater County region. "It's an honor," Ben said when she shared the news. "Your father would be proud. Would you mind? The extra responsibility, the attention it would bring?" "I'd be proud to be married to the finest teacher in the territory," Ben replied without hesitation. "Besides, our children will need a good education." Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the busy season of planting and preparation. Martha's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she had to curtail some of her more strenuous activities as her condition became apparent. The community rallied around her with gifts of baby clothes and advice, treating her coming child as a collective blessing. One warm April morning, as Martha worked in the kitchen garden planting vegetables for the summer harvest, she felt the first labor pains. Mrs. Chen immediately took charge, sending Ben for the midwife while she prepared the bedroom and boiled water. "First babies take their time," Mrs. Chen assured Martha as the contractions strengthened. "You have many hours yet. Rest between pains, save strength for hard work ahead." The labor progressed through the afternoon and into the evening. Ben paced the kitchen like a caged wolf, starting at every sound from upstairs. Tom Brennan finally took pity on him and produced a bottle of whiskey, though Ben was too nervous to drink more than a sip. Near midnight, Martha gave birth to a healthy son with his father's dark hair and strong lungs that announced his arrival to the entire household. When the midwife finally allowed Ben into the room, Martha saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he gazed at their child. "He's perfect," Ben whispered, touching one tiny fist with a careful finger. "Look at him, Martha. Look what we made." "What shall we call him?" Martha asked, exhausted but radiant with joy. "Theodore," Ben said without hesitation. "After your father, Theodore Hayes." Martha's eyes filled with tears at the honor Ben paid her father's memory. "Theodore Benjamin Hayes," she corrected. "For both his grandfathers." The christening took place on a beautiful Sunday in May, with the entire community gathered to welcome little Theodore into their fellowship. Reverend Moats performed the ceremony in the Hayes parlor, since the baby was still too young for travel to town. Martha held their son while Ben stood proudly beside her, surrounded by the friends who'd become their chosen family. "Do you promise to raise this child in the fear and admonition of the Lord, to teach him the difference between right and wrong, and to guide him in the paths of righteousness?" Reverend Moats asked. "We do," Martha and Ben replied in unison. As summer progressed into autumn, Martha returned to her teaching duties with baby Theodore sleeping in a basket beside her desk. The older children delighted in helping care for him, and Martha found that motherhood added new depth to her understanding of protection and sacrifice. One evening in late September, as she and Ben sat on their porch watching Theodore take his first wobbly steps across the yard, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if someone else had bid on me that day?" she asked. "Never," Ben replied firmly. "God put us in each other's path for a reason. Everything that happened, good and bad, led us here. Even Ward's corruption? Especially that. It forced us to fight for what we wanted, to prove our love was worth defending." Ben pulled her closer against his side. "Besides, if life was easy, we might not appreciate what we have." As winter approached again, bringing with it the cozy intimacy of long evenings by the fire, Martha found herself pregnant once more. This time, the prospect of another child filled her with quiet joy rather than nervous excitement. She knew now what to expect, and she had confidence in her ability to mother their growing family. The second baby, a daughter they named Anna Rose, arrived during a February blizzard that trapped the midwife at the ranch for 3 days. Mrs. Chen declared the timing auspicious, saying that children born during storms would be strong and resilient. "Just like her mother," Ben observed, cradling his daughter while 2-year-old Theodore played at his feet. Just like her father, Martha corrected, watching Ben's gentle competence with both children. By the time spring returned again, the Hayes household had settled into the comfortable rhythm of an established family. Martha taught school 3 days a week, with Mrs. Chen caring for the children while she worked. Ben had expanded the ranch operation, adding sheep to complement their cattle, and had been elected to the Territorial Council as a representative of Sweetwater County. "We should add more rooms to the house," Martha suggested one evening as they planned for the future. "If we're going to keep having children." "Are we?" Ben asked with a grin. "I certainly hope so. I'd like at least 4, maybe 5. I love your ambition, Mrs. Hayes. Though we might need to hire more help around here. Mrs. Chen's niece is coming from San Francisco next month. She could help with the children and the household." Their third child, a son they named James William, arrived the following winter during the Christmas season. The timing seemed perfect to Martha, as if their growing family was a gift celebrating the season of hope and renewal. As the years passed, the Hayes Ranch became known throughout the territory as a model of frontier prosperity and community cooperation. Martha's school produced some of the best-educated children in Arizona, many of whom went on to attend territorial colleges or start successful businesses. Ben's reputation for honest dealing and community leadership led to his appointment as territorial judge, a position he accepted with the understanding that justice should serve all people equally. Their family grew to include 6 children in total: Theodore, Anna, James, Michael, Elizabeth, and finally little Sarah, born when Martha was 38 and content to declare their family complete. The house expanded with their needs, becoming a comfortable 2-story home with wide porches and plenty of room for the organized chaos of a large family. One autumn evening, 15 years after that fateful day at the auction yard, Martha stood in her kitchen preparing supper while her children did their homework at the big oak table Ben had built. Theodore, now a young man of 17, was helping his younger siblings with their arithmetic, displaying the same patient teaching ability his mother had shown. Through the window, Martha could see Ben returning from the fields with the older boys, their voices carrying across the yard as they discussed the day's work. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s but still spry, was hanging laundry with Elizabeth's help, the two of them chattering in a mixture of English and Chinese that made Martha smile. "Ma, baby Sarah's crying," Anna called from the parlor where she'd been mending socks. "Bring her here, dear," Martha replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's almost feeding time anyway." As Anna brought the baby and Martha settled into the rocking chair Ben had made for nursing their first child, she felt the same overwhelming gratitude that had sustained her through all the years since her rescue from destitution. Her father would have been proud, she knew, to see the life she'd built from the ashes of their shared loss. "Tell us the story again, Ma," young Michael requested as the family gathered for supper. "About how you and Pa met." "Yeah," echoed Elizabeth. "Tell about the auction and the bad man and how Pa saved you." Martha looked around the table at her children's eager faces, then at Ben's amused expression. The story had become family legend, told and retold with embellishments that grew more dramatic with each telling. "Well," Martha began, settling back in her chair with baby Sarah in her arms, "it was a spring morning, and I was facing the worst day of my life." As she told the familiar tale, Martha caught Ben's eye across the table. In his gaze, she saw the same love and wonder that had carried them through their courtship, their struggles, and their triumphs. They had built something beautiful together, not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of love and community that would endure long after they were gone. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, promising the quiet months ahead when the family would gather close around the fire, sharing stories and planning for spring. Martha pulled her shawl closer and smiled, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, as they always had. The debt that had brought them together had been paid long ago in dollars and labor. But the deeper debt, the one of love and loyalty, sacrifice and shared dreams, that was a debt they would spend their lifetimes joyfully fulfilling, payment made not in coin but in the countless small acts of devotion that turned a house into a home and strangers into family. In the distance, coyotes called to the moon, their voices wild and free. But here in the warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, Martha Hayes knew she had found something infinitely more precious than freedom. She had found home.